April 15, 1931, a mob boss sat down for veal and red wine at a quiet Coney Island restaurant. He was laughing by the second course, bragging, relaxed, unarmed. His most trusted lieutenant excused himself to the restroom. 5 minutes later, bullets ripped through the linen and into his chest. By dessert, Joe Mafia was dead, and lucky Luciano, he never came back. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. It was the spring of 1931. New York City stood restless beneath a haze of money, blood, and ambition. The streets had tasted the bitterness of war. Mafia against Maranzano, Sicilian against Sicilian, and the sky above Manhattan bore witness to an empire built on betrayal. But behind the thick velvet drapes of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, on a floor high above the city's grime and noise, something ancient was about to die, and something cold, calculated, and immortal was about to take its place. Cut 2. Interior a lavish suite. The air is dense with cigar smoke. Suits shuffle. Whiskey glasses clink. Shadows stretch long across Persian rugs. They arrived in pairs. Each man trailed by eyes that had seen war and survived it. Vincent Mangano, Joe Profaci, Tommy Gagliano, Al Capone sent Frank Nitti in his place. Even Buffalo's Stefano Magaddino made the trip. Some had sat across from each other as enemies just months before. Some had ordered the other's brother buried in shallow Staten Island soil. But today no bullets were drawn because Charles Lucky Luciano had summoned them, and Lucky wasn't the type of man you refused twice. He sat not at the head of the long mahogany table, but just left of center. A deliberate choice that made him look approachable, cooperative. But no one in the room mistook the gesture. Luciano held the floor like a conductor holding silence just before the music. He wore a tailored gray pinstripe, understated but pristine. A fresh carnation rested on the lapel, cream white, like bone. The man who'd clawed his way out of tenement alleys now ran entire burrows from behind silk wallpaper. He had the scars to prove it, and the eyes of someone who'd learned to smile just wide enough to hide the knife. Luciano stood. Slowly, no theatrics, no grand opening line, just a breath and a voice that never needed to raise itself. We can keep killing each other, or we can build something bigger than any of us. The room didn't erupt in applause. These were not men given to poetry or promises, but something passed through them in that moment. A flicker of self-preservation, of strategy. The war had nearly consumed them all. They'd buried too many friends, watched too many fortunes crumble. Luciano's proposal was simple, radical, terrifying. A commission, not a boss of bosses. Like Maranzano had declared himself before dying with a knife in his chest. Not another dictatorship wrapped in Sicilian arrogance, but a board, a council of equals, 5 major families, a few satellites, and one rule above all: no boss had final say over the others. Disputes would be voted on. Power would be shared. Bloodshed, at least theoretically, would be negotiated first. It was crime as capitalism, the Mafia as a multinational. To the older dons in the room, it was blasphemy. To the younger ones, it was brilliance. Luciano was 29 years old, and already he was speaking like a CEO. But he didn't just offer a structure, he offered a future. You got numbers? Gambling? Vice? You'll keep it. Your people stay your people. Your streets stay your streets. But we settle scores in here, like men. He didn't threaten them. He didn't have to. They all knew what had happened to Joe the boss, Mafia, how Luciano had invited him to lunch, excused himself to the bathroom, and left the table just in time for Vito Genovese and Bugsy Siegel to fire 5 rounds into the man's back. And they all knew how Maranzano, who crowned himself capo di tutti capi, had choked on his own blood in an office just weeks later, a gift from Luciano's assassins in IRS uniforms. Those weren't just killings, they were message carvings. This wasn't just about ambition. Luciano had watched the old ways devour the new world. He'd seen Sicilian pride blind men to the realities of capitalism, law enforcement, and changing times. He wasn't sentimental, he was surgical. By nightfall, a new thing existed in America. It had no legal charter, no public address, no name in the papers. But it would shape the country's underworld for the next half-century. The commission, Luciano named the 5 core families with almost clinical precision. Mangano in Brooklyn, Gagliano in the Bronx, Profaci in southern Brooklyn and Long Island, Bonanno in Williamsburg, and himself, the Luciano family, the spine of Manhattan. The outer families would be allowed input, but the big 5 ruled the table. There would be votes. Not decrees, elections, not coronations. And the first rule passed unanimously: no boss of bosses ever again. Of course, the press never understood what had happened. They never saw the map drawn on napkins. They didn't hear the words whispered in Sicilian, English, Yiddish, or blood. But the streets knew. Bookmakers stopped glancing over their shoulders. Dock bosses slept easier. And within a year, the Mafia would be operating more like a holding company than a crime ring, quietly overseeing everything from garbage unions to heroin routes. Luciano hadn't just won the war, he had rewritten the rule book. And not with force, but with vision. He didn't want to be a king. He wanted to be a system, and systems, they don't bleed, they don't betray, they endure inside. Luciano remains. He's alone now. Just the clink of ice melting in a forgotten glass, a knock at the door, a bellhop enters. Luciano doesn't look up. He's staring out the window at a city that no longer runs without his permission. Outside, people hail taxis, laugh in theater, lines, eat dinner under gas lamps. They don't know that just above them, a new invisible empire has been born, one without borders, one without flags. Only rules, only men, and the price of disobedience. Then the faintest sound of a typewriter. Clack, clack, clack. A single name appears in white on screen. Charles Lucky Luciano, New York, 1931, and beneath it, in smaller type, build the machine, then disappear behind it. It began with sulfur and silence. In the hills of central Sicily, beneath skies dusted with ash, the village of Lercara Fritti breathed smoke from the mouths of underground mines. The men who worked them came home broken, lungs full of poison, hands worn to the bone. No one spoke much. There was nothing left to say. Salvatore Lucania was born into this world in 1897, a child of volcanic stone, poverty, and dust. The kind of place where a boy learned early to watch his tone and keep his eyes low. His father, Antonio, labored daily in the sulfur pits. His mother, Rosalia, kept house with quiet dignity, praying the ash would not bury them before God remembered their name. But Sicily had long ago forgotten how to feed its own. In 1906, the Lucanias boarded a ship bound for America. They didn't call it hope. They called it necessity. It took them 2 weeks to reach Ellis Island. When they arrived, their names were twisted by clerks into something more manageable. Their accents confused the gatekeepers. Their faces were just more ink in the ledger. They were poor, foreign, dispensable. The Lucanias settled in New York City's Lower East Side, a place as brutal as the pits they'd escaped, just louder. Tenement buildings stacked on top of each other like dying lungs. Children swarmed alleys, sewage swirled through streets after rain, and every block belonged to someone. Irish, Jewish, Italian, German. You learned quick. Your name was a flag, and every flag had enemies. Salvatore started school at public School 19, where English was taught with fists and insults. He didn't last long. By age 10, he was skipping class, fighting on corners, running errands for neighborhood hoods. Teachers called him a lost cause. But even then, he had something most boys didn't. Restraint, not kindness, not morality, but control. He'd throw a punch if needed, but only after deciding it was worth it. He was learning and he was watching. He studied how the Irish boys moved in groups, never alone, how the Jewish gangs controlled the pushcart trade with whispers and razors, how Italian men, hardened by both worlds, Sicily and the sidewalk, stood still in doorways like statues with switchblades. Some kids dreamed of being policemen. Salvatore dreamed of never having to answer to one. By age 13, Salvatore was working for a local Sicilian street crew, running package drops between opium dens and gambling parlors. The pay was pocket change, 10 cents for an errand, maybe $1 for a message, but it wasn't about money yet. It was about knowing who to look at and who to look past. It was about earning the right to be invisible when needed, and unmistakable when not. The cops started knowing his name, not well enough to pin anything, but well enough to remember his face. His first arrest came at age 16, petty theft, a pack of cigarettes, maybe a few stolen gloves. It didn't stick, but the booking sheet marked the beginning of something else, a paper trail, one that would run for decades, one that would outlive the man himself. Still, there was nothing lucky about him. Not yet. That name wouldn't come until blood hit the sidewalk years later. Back then, he was just Sal, another immigrant kid dodging truant officers and selling hot goods on the corner of Grand and Forsyth. If you looked fast, you'd miss him. If you looked too long, you'd regret it. He never spoke more than he needed, never threatened unless it bought him time, but he watched and remembered every insult, every favor, every lesson carved into the brick. By his mid-teens, Salvatore joined the 5 Points Gang, one of the most notorious street gangs in New York. Their leader, Paul Kelly, was a former prize fighter who knew how to blend brutality with business. Under Kelly, the gang acted like a training ground for future crime lords, a kind of underworld academy. This was where Salvatore met Meyer Lansky, a brainy Jewish kid with an eye for numbers, and Bugsy Siegel, Lansky's quick-tempered enforcer. The three would form a triangle of ambition that would reshape crime in America. But first, they had to survive. The 5 Points Gang controlled everything from brothels to election fraud. If you could punch or lie well, you had a future. Salvatore was small, but sharp. He didn't fight dirty. He fought smart. He'd feint with a smile, joke before swinging, walk away if the odds didn't favor him. Violence was a tool, not a compass. He wasn't chasing chaos, he was chasing respect. And in a city built on cruelty, respect only came after fear. It was around this time he anglicized his name, Salvatore. Lucania became Charles Luciano. The choice wasn't just practical. It was symbolic. He was shedding the skin of the immigrant, becoming something in between, not fully American, not fully Sicilian, just necessary. And soon, even the cops would stop calling him by his birth name. To the men on the street, he was just Charlie. To his rivals, a whisper to himself. He was a man building a blueprint no one else could see yet. In those early years, Luciano moved through Harlem's heroin trade, Lower Manhattan's gambling circuits, and the East Side's bootlegging dens like a ghost, showing up where he wasn't expected, leaving before the bullets started flying. He wasn't loud, but his presence was undeniable. He wasn't looking for glory. He was looking for structure, even. Then, long before the commission, he saw what most thugs couldn't, that chaos was bad for business. He never liked cigars, never drank heavily, and he never let a woman sleep over more than once, not because he feared intimacy, but because every attachment was a liability. By 1919, Luciano had risen from petty thief to trusted lieutenant under Joe the Boss, Mafia, the most feared Italian gangster in New York, but even as he served, he studied. Watching how Mafia ruled with brute force, how loyalty was demanded, not earned, it reminded him of Sicily. And Luciano hadn't left sulfur and silence behind just to be ruled by it again. So he smiled, nodded, took notes, and waited, because everything in his life, the journey across the Atlantic, the bruises in alleyways, the betrayals in back rooms, was leading him somewhere. He wasn't sure where yet, but it wouldn't be the Lower East Side. And it wouldn't be the back of a butcher shop. It would be higher, cleaner, quieter. And when he got there, he wouldn't ask for permission. The boy from Sicily had crossed oceans, learned the codes of 3 languages, and seen how money moved through the veins of a city like blood. By 23, Luciano had survived street wars, prison nights, gang infighting, and more betrayals than he could count. But he had never once stopped moving forward, and now the map of New York no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a blueprint, and he was the architect. It was 1914 when Salvatore Lucania, now calling himself Charles more often than not, began making the kinds of moves that drew real attention, the kind that lingered in a man's jacket long after he left the room. He was still barely 17, but the way he carried himself on the street made people check twice before. Speaking his name, the 5 Points Gang was already a force in Manhattan's underworld. It had been built by men like Paul Kelly and Johnny Torrio, brutal visionaries who knew that if crime was inevitable, it might as well be orchestrated like an empire. Luciano was still on the bottom rung, running errands between brothels and betting parlors, but even then, it was obvious he wasn't built like the other kids. He didn't talk much. He didn't chase glory. He took mental notes on everything, who owed who cracked under pressure, which policeman looked the other way, and for how much. In those days, he was rarely the one holding the blade, but somehow he was always nearby. When it fell, he met Torrio briefly at the turn of a corner in Little Italy, delivering a small satchel stuffed with marked bills and a note. Torrio glanced at him once, then twice, and gave a slow nod that said more than words ever could. These were men who recognized investment when they saw it. In the 5 Points Gang, he'd crossed paths with names that would one day make headlines. Frank Costello, Bugsy Siegel, a young brawler from Brooklyn named Al Capone, whose temper was a thing of legend even before the scars. They drank together, brawled together, paid off beat cops together, and they learned every block was a classroom and every mistake cost blood. But Lucky didn't make the same mistake twice. Not ever. He started small, pushing heroin on street corners. It was dangerous work, and not just from the cops. Heroin was still new to the streets, still volatile, still seen as the filthiest of poisons. Selling it required nerves and precision. It also required a disregard for rules that had governed the old Italian ways for generations. Luciano didn't care about tradition. He didn't care about keeping things in the family. If a man could make money, Lucky worked with him, Jew, Irish, Italian. It didn't matter. The first time he brokered a deal with Maya Lansky, it shocked the neighborhood. But Lansky wasn't just smart. He was brilliant, and Luciano didn't care who you prayed to. As long as you kept your mouth shut and your math straight together, they made a pact. Not in blood, not in some old country ritual, just in understanding. Survival first, loyalty second, power always. There were arrests, of course, no one moved that much product or cash without catching the eye of the law. He was picked up in 1916 for drug possession, caught again in 1917 for selling heroin to an undercover cop. Each time, he served a few months, short stints in holding pens full of broken men and ambition. But jail didn't slow him down. If anything, it sharpened him. He used time behind bars like others used classrooms. He asked questions, watched how others ran crews, memorized the hierarchy of guards, the bribery routines, the gaps in surveillance. Every mistake someone else made became a rule for him not to break. By the time he was 20, he'd stopped being a runner. Now he gave orders. Now he took his cut off the top. His suits were better, his posture straighter. He wasn't rich, yet not in the way he would be, but he had something more dangerous than wealth. He had momentum. That's when the nickname first surfaced. Some said it was ironic that he got the name Lucky after surviving a brutal beating and stabbing in 1929. But the truth is it came earlier. It started in whispers. He always seemed to walk away from arrests, from ambushes, from deals gone sideways. One day he'd be seen surrounded by cops, his hands behind his back. 2 days later, he'd be back on the block, smirking, untouched. He wasn't lucky, he was prepared. He knew which judges to pay, which officers to flatter, and which witnesses to frighten into forgetting what they'd seen. But the streets needed stories, and so they gave him a legend. The real test came with his first sanctioned hit. Not a brawl, not a message, a killing. A problem had emerged in the supply chain. A man named Bracco, loud and erratic, was skimming from the heroin take. Worse, he was doing it carelessly, flashing money, buying up favors, drawing heat. Luciano was told to handle it. No ceremony, no theater. He invited Bracco to a gambling house on Delancey. No one said a word when the man entered the back room. No one asked questions when he didn't come out. That night, Luciano went home, removed his coat, and ordered Chinese takeout. He ate alone, listening to jazz drift through the window from a neighbor's radio. He didn't speak of it. Not to Kostlo, not to Lansky. It wasn't personal. It was necessary. And he had learned from the Sicilian codes. The first kill should never be the hardest. If it is, you're not built for what comes next. From then on, his name held weight. Small-time hoods began to step aside when he walked into a room. Women followed him with their eyes. Bartenders remembered his drink. He preferred bourbon, neat. His suits were all tailored, pinstripes, always clean. He kept his nails manicured and carried a gold-plated cigarette case. Though he rarely smoked more than 2 a day, image mattered, and in that world, image was power. But what separated Luciano from the rest wasn't his charm or his ruthlessness. It was his belief that crime didn't have to be messy, that blood should be a last resort, and only if it returned investment. He'd say it often in later years. There's no point in making enemies if you're still counting your money. That philosophy, radical for its time, earned him both followers and skeptics. The old-school bosses saw him as arrogant, too young, too American. But the younger crowd saw something else, a blueprint for the future, and slowly, those who had doubted him began to reach for his hand instead of their guns. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was ascending. By 1920, Luciano had a small crew of his own and a growing network of contacts from Harlem to Hoboken. He was making real money now. Thousands a week, heroin, gambling, extortion, bootlegging. The streams flowed separately, but all fed into his river. And through it all, he kept working with Lansky and Siegel. They operated like a silent trinity. Brains, brawn, and balance. They didn't trust easily, but they trusted each other. There's an old saying, blood makes you related, loyalty makes you family. In a world where friends died young and partnerships ended in gunfire, the bond between them was rare and dangerous. By his mid-20s, Luciano had built a reputation as a man who could handle anything. Heat from the police, betrayals from within, shifting alliances. He wasn't a king yet, but the streets had started treating him like one. And what he understood better than anyone was that every empire begins not with a crown, but with a kill. He'd made his first. Now he was ready for more. It was a time made for men like Charles Luciano. The 1920s arrived with a manic pulse, roaring into New York like jazz on fire. The war was over, but another was just beginning, quieter, more profitable, soaked in gin and machine oil. Prohibition turned liquor into gold, and in the space between law and demand, gangsters became kings. Luciano wasn't just surviving anymore. He was sculpting the city to fit his hands. By then, he had aligned himself with Giuseppe Masseria, known as Joe the Boss, a barrel-chested, old-world gangster who ruled Manhattan's Italian rackets with superstition and fists. Masseria spoke little English, distrusted anything unfamiliar, and believed omerta was sacred. To most, he was a relic of Sicily, paranoid, brutal, and anchored in the past, but he needed muscle. And more importantly, he needed brains. Luciano offered both. He became Masseria's protege, but never his puppet. At the same time, Luciano kept his ties with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. It was a dangerous balancing act. The old Sicilian bosses frowned on mixing with Jews or Irish or anyone outside the blood. But Luciano saw what Masseria didn't, that money had no ethnicity, and America was no longer Sicily. From a brownstone on Mulberry Street, Luciano ran liquor through the city like blood through veins. Speakeasies in Harlem, gin joints in Hell's Kitchen, truck routes lined with cops on his payroll. He carved out corridors of profit where most saw only risk. His bookkeepers were faster than his gunmen. His warehouses were cleaner than some. Hospitals, one bar alone in Midtown, the Marigold Club, pulled in $12,000 a week in untaxed profits, money that flowed directly into his pocket. And still he was careful. He never put his name on anything. Everything was run through shell companies, paid out in cash, cleaned through gambling dens or brothels. If one business fell, another rose. If a shipment was intercepted, a second was. Already on the move in Jersey by 1923, Luciano had more than money. He had reach. He kept an apartment on Park Avenue, not a gaudy penthouse, but a tailored space with polished oak floors and silk drapes. His suits were hand-stitched from Italy, his shoes imported. He preferred muted ties, always straight, never loud. His signature cologne, Flores No. 89, lingered in rooms long. After he left them, he dated showgirls and dancers, always one at a time, never the same one twice in a month. Rumors circled about a nightclub singer he'd loved deeply once, a woman named Evelyn, who vanished from the scene as quickly as she'd arrived. No one ever saw her again, and Luciano never spoke her name. He told one associate years later, "The more you love, the more they can use you still." For all his elegance, violence never strayed far. He once dragged a man named Tommaso Russo down 3 flights of stairs in the Bronx, not because he owed money, but because he'd lied about how much. When the body hit the sidewalk, Luciano dusted off his jacket, lit a cigarette, and hailed a cab without a word. Another time, he had a bootlegger buried alive behind a butcher's shop for double-crossing Lansky on a shipment of Canadian whiskey. There was no funeral, just silence, and a warning that traveled faster than the blood ever could. These weren't acts of rage, they were acts of management. Luciano didn't kill out of passion. He killed out of principle, and he never, ever repeated himself. He once told Lansky, "If they see you hurt a man twice, they stop believing the first one mattered." At the same time, he was building something few in that world had ever touched, political influence. He donated to judges' campaigns anonymously, paid for city clerks' children to attend private schools, lent money to a local pastor whose parish was close to the edge. These weren't acts of generosity. They were lines written in ink before the contracts even arrived. He understood something fundamental. Bullets could change a block, but ballots, bought and buried, could change a city. By 1925, Luciano had become a man both adored and feared. A shadow that moved through Manhattan with polished shoes and a wristwatch worth more than most men's yearly take. To the press, he was a rising figure of interest. To the police, a ghost they couldn't catch. To his enemies, a problem they couldn't solve. Joe Masseria trusted him enough to put him at the center of operations. Luciano collected debts, organized routes, handled payroll. But even as he climbed, he was already looking down, not in arrogance, but in strategy. He saw that Masseria's methods were slipping. The old man demanded tribute from everyone, even allies. He made enemies faster than friends. He alienated the Jewish crews, taxed. The Irish ignored the Cubans. His empire was wide but brittle. Luciano wanted something sturdier. He imagined a world where crime ran like business, where rackets were balanced like ledgers, where grudges were costly and wars were rare. But, to build that world, he'd have to survive the one Masseria ruled, and Masseria, for all his ignorance, wasn't blind. He began watching Luciano closer, whispered questions to his men, checked reports twice. Luciano, in turn, became colder. He rarely smiled. He drank less. He refused to take phone calls after midnight. He stopped bringing women to meetings. Even Bugsy noticed. One night, in the back of a Harlem club, Lansky asked him, "You trust him?" Luciano stared at his drink for a long moment, then said, "I don't trust myself. Why would I trust him?" That same year, Luciano took a meeting with a city alderman, privately, off the books, no security. It was about zoning laws, permits for warehouses along the East River. But it was also about power, the kind of power you didn't win with guns. He left that meeting with a contract in hand and two more in his pocket. He was playing chess while others argued about checkers. But beneath the polish, something darker stirred. Despite the luxury, despite the success, Luciano was haunted by a singular fear that no matter how far he rose, they'd never see him as more than a thug. He wasn't born into society. He'd never own a country estate or sit on a board with steel magnates. The old money families would never let him through their doors. No matter how well he dressed or how many politicians he bought, he was a criminal, and he knew it. But he also knew how to wear that label like armor. He once told a young runner, "They'll never let us be princes, so we become kings instead." By 1927, Luciano controlled more than a dozen major rackets across 3 boroughs. He had leverage in City Hall, friends on both sides of the law, and a growing reputation across the country. But power came at a price. His enemies were multiplying. The more he grew, the more Masseria felt the pressure. The old boss sensing the shape of his own extinction in the figure of his own protege. And Luciano? He never said it aloud, but he had already begun calculating the future, not just for himself, but for the entire underworld. And it would begin with blood. It began with silence, the kind that creeps in when men who've known power begin to sense its decay. By 1929, New York was no longer one city. It was a battlefield divided by loyalties and bloodlines. 2 names hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire: Joe, the boss, Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano. One represented the old guard, the other a rival vision of the same decaying code, and between them stood Charles Luciano. Still in his early 30s, Luciano had become Masseria's most trusted lieutenant. He collected his envelopes, arranged his meetings, and even selected the girls who accompanied him to the theater. But trust in the underworld is a currency with an expiration date. Masseria, who had once laughed too loud and eaten with both hands, now grew paranoid. He ordered more guns on his table than forks. His orders became erratic, his enemies too numerous to name. He suspected everyone. Even Luciano, for his part, played the role well. He nodded when summoned, delivered when asked, never once showing the contempt that had slowly hardened inside him. Because by now he had seen the future, and it looked nothing like Joe Masseria. Across town, Salvatore Maranzano, an older, more calculating Sicilian, had begun gathering his own power. His roots ran deep in the town of Castellamare del Golfo in Sicily, and many of his soldiers were cut from the same cloth. Where Masseria relied on muscle and loyalty, Maranzano leaned on strategy and structure. Luciano met with Maranzano in secret. The first time was in a parked car in a church lot off Fordham Road. No names were spoken aloud, just promises, hints, understandings passed through glances and measured phrases. Luciano wanted peace. Maranzano wanted power. They would give each other both. For now, but first, one thing had to happen. Joe Masseria had to die. It was betrayal in the truest sense. Not just of a boss, but of a code. Masseria had brought Luciano in when he was still raw, still unproven, but Luciano didn't see a father figure when he looked at Joe. He saw a wall, and the only way forward was through it, so he made a plan. Not loud, not messy, just final. April 15th, 1931, a Tuesday. Luciano invited Masseria to lunch at Nuova Villa Tamaro, a quiet restaurant in Coney Island, known more for its fried clams than its bloodshed. It was a strange choice for a man like Joe, who rarely left Manhattan unless forced. But Luciano made it seem casual. A chat, a meal, a warm spring afternoon near the boardwalk. They arrived together just past noon. The place was nearly empty, a favor arranged in advance. Luciano ordered a glass of Chianti. Masseria chose veal and eggplant. For 20 minutes they talked business, weather, women. Luciano laughed at the right times, refilled his boss's wine, then, just before dessert, he excused himself to the restroom. Outside, Vito Genovese, Bugsy Siegel, Albert, Anastasia, and Joe Adonis were waiting in a borrowed car. All men who had built reputations on silence and speed. Luciano passed them without a word. The hit was swift. Witnesses said the shots came in bursts, like fireworks muffled by walls. 5 bullets struck Masseria, 1 through the hand, 3 in the chest, and a final shot directly into the face. His head slumped onto the white tablecloth. A wine glass shattered in his lap. When the police arrived, they found Masseria alone, still, clutching a playing card in one hand, the ace of spades, it would be said, though no one could confirm if that was true or just the kind of detail stories grow over time. Luciano, when asked later, claimed he'd stepped outside to take a phone call. He never returned, and just like that, the war seemed over. Masseria's death sent a tremor through the underworld. The street bosses took it as a signal. The old order was falling. No more superstitions, no more Sicilian rituals. Just power, cold, deliberate, modern. Maranzano seized the moment. Within days, he called a meeting. Dozens of mobsters gathered in a warehouse in the Bronx, there with all the gravity of a general. Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. It was a title borrowed from the old world, one that terrified some and thrilled others. He laid out a structure borrowed from Caesar's Rome. Families, hierarchies, rules, discipline, and at the top, Maranzano himself. Luciano listened, nodded, applauded, but inside, something turned cold. This wasn't the future. This was the past with better tailoring. Maranzano distrusted innovation. He refused to work with Jewish gangs. He dismissed men like Lansky as outsiders. He treated Luciano like a useful dog. Valuable but not respected. Worse still, Maranzano began quietly compiling lists. Men to be removed, Luciano's name was at the top. Maranzano had learned from Maseria's fall. He knew the danger of letting younger wolves gather strength, so he planned to strike first. Luciano found out through a quiet contact, a young courier who overheard a conversation between Maranzano's men in a warehouse stairwell. The message was simple: eliminate Luciano, make it clean. Luciano didn't panic. He planned again, and this time he wouldn't make the mistake of replacing one tyrant with another. The betrayal had to be total and surgical. He reached out to Lansky and Siegel. Together, they arranged for assassins, not Sicilians, but Jewish gunmen from downtown. Men Maranzano wouldn't recognize, men who wouldn't hesitate. September 10th, 1931. Maranzano's office was located on the 9th floor of the New York Central Building, near Grand Central Terminal. That morning, he called Luciano for a meeting. Likely a setup. Luciano sent his regards, then sent his killers instead. They entered, dressed as government agents, badges, fedoras, trench coats. The receptionist let them pass. Inside, they moved quickly. One held Maranzano down. Another drove a knife into his chest. The others shot him 5 times. No words, no warning, just execution. The boss of all bosses died gasping for air in his office, surrounded by ledgers and ink. It was over in minutes. With Maseria and Maranzano both gone, Luciano stood alone in the vacuum. But he didn't take the title. He didn't declare himself boss of bosses. Instead, he summoned the heads of the most powerful families and offered something new. A commission, no single ruler, no supreme authority. Just a board made of equals who would resolve disputes, approve hits, and keep the business running like a machine. It was radical, American, dangerous, and it worked. Luciano had betrayed 2 kings and still emerged untouched. He had survived war not by hiding, but by designing its end. He once told a friend years later, "You either learn how to end the war, or you learn how to die in it." That spring and summer of 1931 changed everything. The old Mafia died at a white-clothed table in Coney Island. The new one was born in silence, behind locked doors, in quiet rooms, in the minds of men who understood that power was never about being feared. It was about being necessary. Luciano was now the most necessary man in organized crime, and no one could say exactly when it happened, because that's how he wanted it. The 9th floor of the New York Central Building felt too quiet that morning. September 10th, 1931. A Thursday. Clear skies above Grand Central. Just blocks away, the city moved as it always did. Brisk shoes on sidewalks, horns slicing through air, steam curling from grates like smoke from a ritual fire. But inside that tall, stony structure on Park Avenue and 46th, death was waiting. Not loudly, not clumsily, just with purpose. Salvatore Maranzano, boss of all bosses, had summoned Charles Luciano for a meeting. He wanted to discuss structure, discipline, the order of things. Maybe he meant to warn him. Maybe he meant to kill him. By then, Luciano wasn't asking questions. He was already answering them. The building's elevator doors opened at 9:15. No one paid much attention. To the 4 men who stepped out, they looked official, clean-shaven, solemn, dressed in dark suits with badges clipped to their inner pockets. Federal agents, some thought, Treasury men. The country was still tangled in prohibition after all, and those guys were everywhere. But they weren't IRS. They were Luciano's assassins: B.O. Weinberg, Samuel Levine, Red Levine, Joe Lopresti. Jewish contract killers, professional, unfamiliar to Maranzano's guards. And more importantly, unexpected. They didn't knock. They moved through the hallway like smoke, smooth and silent, until they reached Maranzano's outer office. A young assistant tried to rise from her desk, startled. One gunman gestured. With a finger to the lips, she obeyed, terrified. paralyzed. A message passed in silence. Inside, Maranzano was sitting behind a heavy wooden desk. Papers spread before him. The windows were open. A breeze carried the city's noise up from the streets, but he barely noticed. He was 60 years old, heavy with ceremony, proud of the title he had claimed just months earlier, Capo di Tutti Capi. He thought he was safe. He didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't even understand what was happening. The men entered quickly. No introductions, no warning. They closed the door behind them. What happened next lasted less than 2 minutes. A struggle, a scream, a chair knocked over, the sharp report of a blade meeting flesh, gunfire muffled beneath shouts in Sicilian. When it ended, Maranzano lay sprawled on the rug, the air torn from his lungs, 5 bullets, multiple stab wounds, his neck twisted unnaturally, mouth still parted as if trying to finish a sentence no one would hear. No witnesses, no mercy, just the final punctuation of a war that had started years before. The assassins left just as quietly, down the stairs, out into the street. Gone, no sirens followed, no statements were taken, just silence, and history reshaped in its shadow. At that exact hour, Charles Luciano was nowhere near the office. He was uptown, seated in a leather booth at the Central Park Casino, sipping black coffee and reading the paper, calm, measured. His watch ticked quietly beneath the cuff of his tailored jacket. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The news of Maranzano's death spread through the underworld like a pulse. At first, disbelief, then certainty, and finally order, because unlike the last time a king had fallen, there would be no replacement this time. Luciano did not claim the throne. He shattered it. A week later, in a brownstone in Harlem, Luciano called a meeting of the city's remaining power players. Not a show of force, a conversation. No crowns, no oaths, just a plan. He proposed something revolutionary. Not a dictatorship, not a monarchy, but a commission, a governing council of America's major crime families. Each family would retain autonomy, territory, leadership, but disputes would now be settled, not with bullets, but with votes. 5 core New York families. Additional seats for Chicago, Buffalo, and others. Regular meetings, binding decisions, no more endless wars, no more bosses of bosses. Just business. It was crime. Reimagined as infrastructure, Luciano spoke plainly. No flowery words, just a businessman's logic. We act like savages, he told them, so they treat us like animals. Let's act like men. Let's organize. Some resisted. Men like Vincent Mangano clung to the old ways, but others like Frank Costello, Tommy Gagliano, and Joe Bonanno saw what Luciano saw. The future wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being the one who built the room to begin with. Within weeks, the commission was formalized. It wasn't written in ink, but it didn't need to be. Its power was in the understanding, the kind that moved behind doors, not through headlines. And just like that, American organized crime entered a new era. The press didn't understand it. They still ran stories about mob wars and hit lists. They didn't see the spreadsheet behind the gun. They didn't hear the boardroom whispers behind the stabbings, but the streets understood. Luciano had removed the final obstacle to peace, and in doing so, he created a system that could run without him. That was the genius, not control, but continuity. From that day forward, there would be no more kings, only architects, and among them, Luciano was now the first. Still, power changes a man, even when he says it won't. Luciano began carrying himself differently. He moved with a slower cadence, like someone who had nothing left to prove. He spoke in shorter sentences, took longer to answer questions. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't careless either. He rarely used phones, preferred face-to-face, made sure his appointments were known by only 2 people, his driver and his secretary. He wore tailored suits, always in grayscale, with hand-sewn cuffs and subtle stripes. He never wore hats indoors, and he never shook hands unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't arrogance, it was insulation. He had survived too much to invite touch. Death of Maranzano haunted no headlines. There was no public mourning, no protest, just a body in an office, a few closed caskets, and 1,000 shifting loyalties in the dark. But for the underworld, it was as if the calendar had reset. Before Maranzano, chaos. After Maranzano, order. Luciano didn't celebrate. He simply got back to work. He assigned territories, smoothed rivalries, approved investments in Las Vegas. Long before the city had paved its streets, he reviewed ledgers with Lansky, delegated collections to Genovese, allowed Costo to work political channels, and behind it all, he kept the machine moving. What began with a knife in an office became the blueprint for an empire. Luciano never spoke of Maranzano again, not publicly. Not even in court years later. It wasn't a victory to be flaunted. It was a decision, cold, final, and absolutely necessary. In private, he once said to Lansky, "You kill a man like that once, but you have to keep killing the reason he existed for the rest of your life." What he meant was legacy. What he feared was the past returning. But for now, it was quiet. The commission met. Votes were taken. Conflicts were paused. And in that silence, Luciano stood, not as a boss, not as a tyrant, but as something far more dangerous. The man who figured out how to make crime last. The room was nothing like a battlefield, but history was being written just the same. It wasn't filled with smoke or shouting or gunfire. No bodies hit the floor, no knives in backs. It was quiet, controlled, and that was precisely the point. Late 1931, inside a nondescript brownstone in uptown Manhattan, the most powerful men in American organized crime gathered, not for war, but for something far rarer, structure. Luciano sat at the center of the room. Not at the head of the table. He was careful about symbols. He didn't want to be seen as the next boss of bosses. He wanted something smarter, something that wouldn't put a target on his back. He called it the Commission. 5 core families would govern New York City, each with defined territories, operations, and leadership. The Luciano family, the Mangano family, the Bonanno family, the Profaci family, the Gagliano family. Each family was autonomous, independent, but now, for the first time, they were bound by something stronger than tradition, shared interest. No more arbitrary hits, no more turf wars spilling into the streets like broken glass. If one boss wanted another gone, it had to be approved by vote. If disputes arose, the commission settled them behind closed doors. Quietly, efficiently, crime reframed as governance. Luciano didn't invent the idea. Not entirely. He took cues from corporate America, from labor unions, even from the U.S. Senate. He studied what kept power from collapsing. He learned from the mistakes of kings and emperors, from Assyria and Maranzano. The lesson was clear. You don't hold power by clenching it. You hold it by distributing it. Just enough. And so he built something no one else had dared to imagine. A democracy of criminals. The commission wasn't limited to New York. Chicago got a seat. So did Buffalo, under Stefano Magaddino, who controlled most of western New York and parts of Pennsylvania. Eventually, Philadelphia, Detroit, and even Los Angeles would participate in certain votes. But at its core, it was a New York invention. Elegant, brutal, efficient, no charters, no ledgers. But its rules were as real as any constitution. Rule 1. No hits without commission approval. Rule 2. Territories must be respected. Encroachment was war. Rule 3. Disputes would be settled in meetings, not alleyways. Rule 4. Law enforcement must be avoided, bought, or misled, never provoked. Rule 5. No more bosses of bosses, ever. The irony was that everyone knew Luciano was still at the center. Even as he claimed not to lead, everything moved through him. He scheduled the meetings. He reviewed the cases. His word wasn't law, but it was often enough. This was deliberate. Luciano had seen what power looked like in its most fragile form, a title, and he wanted something sturdier, influence without visibility. He ran his family like a company. Vito Genovese served as underboss. Frank Costello, the diplomat, worked political angles. Meyer Lansky, though not Italian and not technically a made man, became the architect of many financial operations, and Cuba, that was Lansky's playground. Luciano saw international potential. If New York was the boardroom, Cuba would be the vault. No U.S. jurisdiction, close enough to manage, corrupt enough to control. They began investing in Havana's casinos, bringing American gamblers and mob capital to Cuban shores. Luciano developed ties with Fulgencio Batista, then a rising figure in Cuban politics. Money flowed easily. Protection followed. The Hotel Nacional became a kind of offshore command center. Luxury, palm trees, music, and power dressed in linen suits. But Cuba wasn't the only expansion. Luciano also reached west, Hollywood, not to act, not to star, but to own, through shell companies. He began financing films, backing unions, even placing enforcers and Teamsters locals. The mob didn't need to appear on the screen. It only needed to own the projector. Unions became one of Luciano's favorite instruments. Longshoremen, garment, workers, theater crews, with the right hands in the right pockets. He could control shipping schedules, film releases, fashion markets, without lifting a gun. Back home, his operations flourished. Bootlegging began to fade as prohibition neared its end, but that didn't slow him. He pivoted quickly to gambling, loan sharking, prostitution, and heroin. Luciano was flexible. Others clung to dying rackets. He adapted. He treated the underworld like a stock portfolio. Invest widely, pull out early, avoid emotion, and through it all, the commission kept everything stable, like the gears of a finely made watch. Each family moved in rhythm, not always in harmony, but in balance. There were occasional cracks, ambitious men, murders that slipped through the cracks, old rivalries that refused to die quietly. But the system endured, and with each passing year, the American Mafia became more organized and more invisible. The press still ran stories about gangland, killings, shadowy meetings, and arrests, but they never understood the depth of the machine. Luciano's genius wasn't in making the Mafia more powerful. It was in making it function like something too big to fail. He never spoke in public, never gave interviews. No written speeches, no photographs if he could avoid it. He didn't want to be seen, he wanted to be felt. He once told a lieutenant, "I don't want applause. I want silence when I walk in, because they know I could speak if I wanted to." By 1934, Luciano's organization had its hands in nearly every major industry in New York, legitimate and otherwise. Ports, trash collection, nightclubs, meatpacking, union pensions, police bribes, political donations. Nothing moved without him knowing, and yet he was never called boss of bosses, because there wasn't one anymore. That was his final protection. He had eliminated the very title that once got men killed. He kept his inner circle tight, rarely trusted outsiders. He rotated meeting spots, changed phone numbers, made sure nothing written ever named him directly. 2. Law enforcement. Luciano was slippery, known but elusive. He didn't carry weapons. He didn't scream in clubs. He dressed impeccably, spoke rarely, and always had an alibi. The Mafia had become an institution, and Luciano was its architect. But there were costs, too. Power brought paranoia. He slept lightly, trusted fewer people each year. He once moved apartments 3 times in a single week just to see who followed. He stopped dating, stopped walking alone. His fingerprints were everywhere, but he kept himself untouchable. To some, it looked like loneliness. To Luciano, it was the price of building something that lasted. He understood what others didn't, that empires don't collapse because of enemies. They collapse because of ego. So he buried his, smiled when needed, disappeared when necessary, and let the commission speak for him, not in words, but in order. For the first time in American history, organized crime was truly organized, not just a collection of gangs, but a system, and at its center was the man who never raised his voice, but made the rules anyway. It began with a photograph, taken in 1935, black and white, grain softened but unmistakably crisp. Charles Lucky Luciano, leaning against the hood of a Packard 12 outside the Waldorf Astoria, one leg crossed over the other, white fedora tilted low, double-breasted suit hugging his frame like tailored armor. His shoes gleamed, his eyes didn't smile. He looked like a man who owned the sidewalk beneath him. The press printed it with nervous fascination. The dapper don who dines like royalty. What they missed was what was just out of frame, the .38 tucked behind his driver's hip, the 2 men scanning the street corners, and the reservation made under someone else's name. Luciano never asked for fame, but he understood that in America, image was a weapon, and he sharpened his daily. He dressed like a Wall Street banker, but he never carried a briefcase. His wardrobe included over 60 suits, mostly grays and blues, each pressed with precision. His cufflinks were white gold, his tie pins subtle. He wore Florist No. 89 cologne, shipped monthly from London. His nails were always clean, his posture never slouched. He read Machiavelli not for philosophy, but for survival. He quoted Shakespeare when it made people pause. He didn't laugh loudly. He let the silence do the heavy lifting. He lived in Suite 39C at the Waldorf, not a fortress, but a palace. It wasn't about hiding anymore. It was about redefining what a gangster could look like, could sound like, could become. He threw dinner parties where politicians and judges brushed shoulders with nightclub singers and racketeers. Everything was candlelight and silver. Conversations flowed in English, Yiddish, Italian, whatever served the moment, and always Luciano watched. He let others speak, let them perform, but it was his stage. Women adored him, dancers, models, debutantes. They circled him like moths to a combed flame. He was elegant, but distant. He never kept a mistress long, never married, never let anyone. Close enough to map the shadows behind his charm. There was one once gay Orlova, a showgirl from Odessa, who'd come to New York on a promise and a steamer trunk. They were seen together often in 1934, private dinners, Central Park walks, whispered laughter in the back of cabs. Some said she softened him, some said he let her believe she had. She disappeared in early 1935. No obituary, no goodbye. Luciano never spoke of her again. He once told Frank Costello, "Every heart has a weakness. I prefer mine not have a name." He dined often at the Waldorf's Peacock Alley, always at the same table, always facing the door. He ordered simply veal cutlets, Bordeaux. He never drank more than 2 glasses. Never left anything on the plate. Discipline was his armor. Even his leisure was strategic. He visited Saratoga Springs during racing season, but never bet more than he could lose. He played cards, but only socially. He didn't gamble. He calculated, but beneath the elegance, the world was still soaked. In blood, associates vanished when their usefulness expired. Some were buried, some were never found. A bookmaker in Brooklyn who skimmed too heavily, gone. A union organizer who asked too many questions, disappeared during a storm. A courier who delivered the wrong package to the wrong address. His body turned up in the East River, wrapped in chains, eyes open. Luciano never issued threats. He didn't need to. His silence was the warning. He once told Lansky, "If they know what you'll do, you've already lost." Power, for him, wasn't in volume. It was in consistency. He ran his empire like a luxury car. No screeching. No smoke, just smooth movement, even when it changed direction. The commission met quarterly by then. Locations rotated. Votes were quick, decisions final. Luciano rarely spoke first, but when he did, no one interrupted. He had stopped needing to remind people who he was. Instead, he reminded them of what he could undo. Still, there were cracks. Beneath the polish, a kind of exhaustion settled in. He slept with the lights on. Even in hotel suites with blackout curtains, he stopped walking. The city alone. His days grew structured, rigid, claustrophobic. There was no room for spontaneity anymore. Only calculation. He once spent 4 weeks tracking a single FBI agent who had taken an interest in his mail route. Not because the man posed an immediate threat, but because he had too much curiosity for someone that junior. The agent was transferred to Cincinnati. Luciano sent flowers to the man's mother, anonymously. He had learned long ago that terror didn't always come from bullets. Sometimes it came from not knowing why the room suddenly got colder. He hated hospitals, refused to visit them. Even when close associates fell ill, he believed illness was weakness, not of the body, but of control. He took vitamin tonics, slept 6 hours a night, walked briskly in the mornings. Never smoked, only 2 cigars a month, and always Cuban. But mentally, he was drifting. By 1936, Luciano had become a celebrity gangster. Though he never asked for the title, magazines speculated on his income. Rumors placed his worth at over $10 million, spread across silent partnerships, land holdings, cash vaults. Reporters tried to interview him. He declined politely, always with a smile that said no twice. His favorite phrase when pressed was, "I'm just a businessman. I give people what they already want." The truth was more complicated. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a paradox, a man who dreamed of being respected. By building something respectable out of crime, he wanted to be remembered, not feared. But he knew fear was the only currency that didn't inflate. So he played both. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, of Luciano visiting an art gallery late at night. A private showing, he walked the rooms slowly, stopping in front of a Goya painting. Dark, violent, intimate. He stared at it for 10 full minutes. When asked what he saw, he said, "A man who tried to paint something he couldn't explain." That's what power feels like. That was Luciano in his golden era, untouchable, well-dressed, surrounded by everything he'd ever wanted, and still somehow completely alone. His throne wasn't made of gold. It was stitched into the seams of his silence, and though the world saw only elegance, white hats, silk ties, ballroom laughter, the man behind the curtain never stopped watching the exits. He had built an empire, but the crown was invisible, and heavy. It began not with a bullet, but with a briefcase. 1935, New York was restless. The streets had quieted, but something colder had moved in, not from the barrel of a gun, but from the thin pages of court filings and wiretap transcripts. A different kind of war had begun. This time it wasn't the Sicilian dons or Jewish toughs with switchblades. This time it was law, and the man leading the charge didn't carry brass knuckles. He wore a bow tie. Thomas E. Dewey, just 33 years old, had been appointed as special prosecutor for New York County. He looked like everything Luciano was not: clean-cut, soft-spoken, educated. He didn't gamble. He didn't smoke. He didn't smile often. But what he lacked in charisma, he made. Up for incalculation, Dewey was ambitious, dangerously so. He wanted more than convictions, he wanted headlines, and in Luciano, he saw the perfect story. The dapper gangster who dined at the Waldorf, the man who had outlived Maranzano, Masseria, and dozens of others, the architect of the commission, a king without a crown, and now the symbol that the city needed to see fall. But Dewey couldn't touch Luciano through the usual channels. The man was too smart. He never signed anything, never left prints, never gave direct orders. His rackets were layered through a web of lieutenants, fences, fronts, and code names. So Dewey changed tactics. He went after him through vice, specifically prostitution. The charges weren't entirely invented, but they weren't entirely clean either. Luciano knew girls worked under his protection. He knew money passed hands. Favors were traded, pimps were taxed. But whether he truly ran a vast, organized, multi-state sex operation, that was murkier, and it didn't matter. What mattered was optics. Dewey's office started interviewing prostitutes. Over 200 women, most picked up off the street. Many were addicts, some were desperate, some lied to avoid jail, some were paid. But they all said the same name, Charlie Lucky. One said she met him in a hotel suite. Another claimed he set prices and enforced discipline. One insisted he once ordered a girl beaten for missing a quota. None of it could be directly proven. But proof was never the point. Narrative was. The press had a field day. Luciano empire built on flesh. Waldorf vice king faces justice. Ladies of the night named their prince. Photos of Luciano, polished, tailored, smiling slightly, were splashed next to images of tearful women in warm coats, their faces blurred or half-lit. The contrast was intentional. Dewey's office fed it daily. Luciano saw what was happening. He wasn't naive, but even he underestimated the momentum behind it. He was arrested in April 1936 at the Waldorf Astoria by plainclothes detectives. No warning, no tip-off. He was led out through the lobby like a banker being escorted to lunch. He said nothing, not when they handcuffed him, not when they read the charges, not even when reporters surrounded the car. His silence was his last shield. The indictment listed 90 counts: conspiracy, compulsion, running an interstate prostitution network. They called him the Overlord, the Generalissimo of the Vice Army. The trial began in May in a packed Manhattan courtroom. The judge wore a stern frown. Dewey wore his bow tie. Luciano wore a gray pinstripe suit, a calm expression, and a steel ring of disbelief circling his heart. He still didn't think they'd pull it off. The prosecution brought 68 witnesses. 37 of them were prostitutes. Some wept, some shook. Some rehearsed statements from note cards. Others rambled. None could connect Luciano directly to payments, decisions, or locations. He wasn't on any payrolls. No phone records linked him. No letters bore his name. But again, that didn't matter. Each day, the headlines told the story before the jury ever heard the evidence. Luciano sat still through it all. His eyes never wandered. He whispered only to his lawyer. He never showed anger, but inside, something began to sink. For all the bodies he'd buried, the wars he'd survived, the betrayals he'd outlived, this was the weapon that might bring him down. Not bullets, but public morality. His attorney argued that the prosecution's case relied on hearsay, paid testimony, coached narratives. He was right, and it changed nothing. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, the room held its breath. Guilty, all counts. Luciano didn't flinch. He adjusted his cufflinks, nodded once, and sat down. When the sentence came, the courtroom stood still. 30 to 50 years, Clinton Correctional Facility, Dannemora, New York. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Luciano had finally been outmaneuvered, not by force, not by betrayal, but by theater. He was led out of the courtroom in silence. No handcuffs this time, just a slow walk to the waiting car. Dozens of cameras clicked. No one spoke. His expression never changed, but something had broken. In the weeks that followed, reporters speculated. How could the great Luciano fall to such thin charges? Why had he stayed in New York instead of fleeing? What would happen to the commission? None of them knew what Luciano knew. That power built in shadow still answered to light. And Dewey had simply dragged the story into the sun. From his prison cell in Dannemora, Luciano wrote short letters. To Lansky, to Costello, to Genovese, simple instructions, no panic. He arranged for his books to be moved, trusted lieutenants to take over key operations. He left nothing to chance, but inside he grieved, not for the empire, not even for the sentence, but for the myth he had lost. He had spent a lifetime building. An image, precise, elegant, untouchable. And in the end, he was brought down by dirty linens and whispering girls, by courtroom seats full of strangers who'd never touched violence, but who'd been told to fear his shadow. Thomas Dewey went on to win the New York governorship in 1944. He ran for president. He lost, but his legend was sealed. Luciano remained in prison, a king in exile, watching from behind concrete walls as the world he built changed without him. But even then, even locked away, he never admitted guilt, and he never forgot what he'd said once before. It's not about who has power, it's about who knows how to lose it without dying. The gate clanged shut like a verdict echoing backward through time. Clinton Correctional Facility, known to most as Dannemora, stood like a stone citadel against the northern New York sky. Cold, remote, built to hold the kinds of men who could no longer be contained by society. Charles Lucky Luciano arrived there in July 1936, wearing a prison-issued wool suit, too rough for his skin and shoes that didn't shine. He said nothing during intake. He gave his name calmly. No aliases, no defiance, just that same distant gaze he had always carried, like someone watching a chessboard that hadn't been set up yet. Dannemora was not a place designed for elegance. Winters turned concrete into frostbitten silence. Summers stank of sweat and metal. The walls were 14 feet high, layered with razor wire and ghosts. Luciano had been sentenced to 30 to 50 years. He was 38, and for the first time in his life the door closed behind him, without a key in his pocket. At first, he adapted. He bribed a guard within the first month, not for escape, but for information, names, transfers, conversations in the mess hall. He paid another to ferry letters out discreetly, folded into newspapers or tucked inside. Ration crates. Within 3 months, Luciano had a system. Visitors were screened. Some turned away, others trusted lieutenants. We ushered into the visitation room with practice nods and sealed envelopes. From inside that cell, he continued issuing orders. To the outside world, it looked like exile. To the underworld, it was remote management. But something had shifted. Time slowed in Dannemora. Days were measured not by profits or meetings, but by the clatter of meal trays and the soft groan of morning cell checks. Luciano kept a rigid routine. Up at 6, washed with cold water, walked the yard, hands in his pockets, read slowly, wrote letters carefully. He still demanded respect from inmates, and most gave it, not because of violence, but because of his quiet, the kind that lingered too long. Still, not everyone bent to it. Younger cons, men raised in steel cities and depression towns, looked at him like a story whose ending had been spoiled. They didn't fear suits or names anymore. They feared silence, the kind that came with a shiv behind a radiator. Luciano kept to himself. He never joined a crew inside. never took part in the card games or protection circles. He remained alone by design. But isolation has weight, and it settles differently. When the mind slows by 1938, 2 years into his sentence, the man who had once brokered peace between warring crime families began to feel something foreign, irrelevance. The commission still ran. The operations continued. Money flowed, but without his name on it, without his hand guiding it. The structure he had built worked too well. He had designed a system that didn't need him to function. That was the brilliance, and now it was the punishment. He started talking more, not to others, to himself. He spoke aloud in the early mornings, phrases under his breath as he paced a cell, lists, names, bits of Italian verse. Once, a guard heard him whisper the word gay, the name of the woman who vanished in 1935. Luciano claimed to sleep 6 hours a night, but others noted the light in his cell, often stayed on until after 2. He reread the same book, The Prince, Machiavelli, 17 times in 18 months. His copy was underlined, margin noted, torn at the spine. He made lists of men he no longer trusted, circled names, drew arrows, sometimes scratched them out and started again. It wasn't madness. Not exactly. It was a mind trying to stay relevant, and a world that had no room for him anymore. His body began to ache. The arthritis in his hands worsened. His knees stiffened in the winter. The cold seeped into his bones in ways he hadn't known back when he wore silk socks and leather soles. Man who had once ruled New York from the back booth of the Waldorf now paced 12 feet of concrete, back and forth, counting steps like prayers. And still, he held on. Even in prison, Luciano never let go of image. He shaved daily, maintained posture, never allowed his shirt to wrinkle. When visitors came, he dressed like a man who'd never been convicted. Slicked hair, clean cuffs, polished tone. He spoke softly, rarely smiled, but occasionally something would flash behind his eyes, a kind of regret that never made it into words. There was a moment in 1939 when a reporter managed to slip a question through the prison's press screening system. "Do you think it was all worth it?" Luciano's reply, scribbled in ink and smuggled out through a kitchen worker, was short. "You only ask that when it ends. I didn't think it would." He had dreamed of legacy, of being remembered as more than a thug. But now, in the eyes of the public, he was no longer the sharp-dressed kingmaker. He was just another mugshot, another gangster brought down by the system, another man who once mattered. His old allies tried to console him. Lansky wrote often, assuring him that everything ran as designed. Genovese visited once, and Luciano barely spoke. Costello sent a tailored suit for when Luciano appeared before the parole board. It was never worn. Luciano had begun to wonder if his legacy had already ossified, not in granite, but in newspaper ink. In 1941, he spent his 5th Christmas behind bars. The prison served cold ham and canned yams. Luciano sat alone, eating slowly, his eyes fixed on nothing. No visitors that day, just the snow outside, thick and silent. Just a man once called Lucky, now reduced to a number on a clipboard and a cell key with no name. But even then, even aging, alone, and forgotten by half the world, Luciano never begged for freedom. He didn't write letters of remorse. He didn't plead bargain. He waited, because he knew history didn't move in straight lines, and somewhere beyond the walls, the world was still unraveling. Europe was at war. America's ports were vulnerable, and Luciano, even from a prison bed, still knew where all the bodies were buried. That knowledge had value, and value had a way of unlocking doors, but that was still ahead. For now, he waited. Stone walls, iron bars, and a mind that refused to stop calculating. Even kings age, even legends are forgotten. But in a cell in Dannemora, The man who taught crime how to behave still sat upright, suit pressed, eyes sharp, as if the next move might come tomorrow, and maybe it would. It was a decision made in the shadows, between fear and necessity, between a country at war and a man behind bars. By 1942, the United States had entered World War II, and New York Harbor had become one of the most crucial logistical arteries in the Allied war effort. It was where weapons were shipped, uniforms packed, soldiers sent off across the Atlantic, but it was also vulnerable, exposed to foreign eyes, foreign sabotage, foreign bombs. Then the fires started. In February. The SS Normandy, once a luxury French liner, now repurposed for American transport, went up in flames at Pier 88. An inferno, an embarrassment. No enemy planes, no German submarines, no clear explanation. 2. The Navy, especially to Naval Intelligence Officer Charles Haffenden, it felt like a warning, one that didn't come from overseas. The suspicion was whispered, not spoken. If someone wanted to cripple the war effort, they wouldn't need bombs. They'd only need longshoremen, dock bosses, the men who controlled the harbor from the inside. And those men answered to only one force, the mob, more specifically. Remnants of Luciano's empire still operating in quiet harmony. Even after his imprisonment, Haffenden faced an impossible truth. To protect American docks, the government would need to negotiate with organized crime. What followed became known decades later as Operation Underworld, a secret, unprecedented pact between the U.S. Navy and men who operated outside every law it claimed to defend. And at the center of it was a prisoner in Dannemora. Charles Luciano had been locked up for 6 years, but his name still meant movement, still meant control. His signature, even in silence, could shift power downriver. From the Bronx to Brooklyn, Haffenden arranged a meeting. The location wasn't recorded. No transcript survives, just one note and a declassified report. Luciano offered cooperation with conditions. He has influence. We believe the threat is real. The conditions were simple. Transfer him to a lower security facility. Better visitation, some autonomy. No promises, just gestures of dignity. The government agreed. Luciano was quietly moved to Great Meadow Correctional Facility in Comstock, New York, far from the icy brutality of Dannemora. There he was allowed contact with trusted associates, the kind of men who didn't need instructions spelled out. In the months that followed, reports of dock thefts declined, sabotage attempts halted. The longshoremen fell in line. Security tightened, not through the Navy, but through whispers, through faces no one questioned, through the invisible pressure of quiet men standing too close. Luciano never took public credit. He never spoke of it openly, but he knew what it was, power. Reshaped into leverage, he had become an accidental patriot. By 1945, the war was tilting toward Allied victory. Luciano's cooperation had helped secure hundreds of troop shipments, thousands of tons of cargo. No headlines bore his name, no medals were issued. But within the Justice Department, a different conversation was happening. What was to be done with him now? Thomas Dewey, now governor of New York, faced pressure from multiple directions. Law enforcement wanted to keep Luciano locked away, a trophy. Italian-American politicians and community leaders called the sentence a blemish. The Navy, though unwilling to speak publicly, quietly pushed for clemency. In January 1946, Dewey signed an order. Luciano would be released on the condition he be deported. He would never step foot on American soil again. It was freedom, wrapped in exile. On February 10, 1946, Charles Luciano boarded the USS Laura Keene at Ellis Island. Reporters were kept at a distance. His final glimpse of the city came from behind a curtain. The skyline he once ruled now blurred by fog and salt. Wind. When the ship docked in Naples, Italy, Luciano stepped onto land that hadn't seen his face since 1906. He was 48, and now he belonged nowhere. Naples was a shell of itself, still scarred from bombings, still clawing at recovery. Luciano arrived with tailored suits, American habits, and a silence that confused local officials. The Italian police watched him closely. The U.S. government disavowed him, and yet he remained relevant. He lived in Hotel Excelsior, overlooking the Bay of Naples, a city of ghosts and steam, where war veterans slept in alleys and cafe windows, reflected only broken dreams. Luciano walked its streets with slow caution, no entourage, just memory. The city didn't fear him, not in the way New York had, but it noticed him, and that was enough. He tried to regain control. He reconnected with old allies, built ties to Cuban operations, coordinated with Lansky and others via intermediaries. But it wasn't the same. The throne was gone. The commission no longer took his calls with reverence. Genovese had risen in his place. Costello smiled but didn't obey, and the new faces, younger, louder, bloodthirsty, treated him like a relic. Even Lansky, his oldest confidant, warned him gently. The game changed. Charlie, you changed it, but it doesn't wait. Still, Luciano couldn't stop moving pieces, couldn't stop watching the board. He hosted meetings in Naples Hotel. Sweets tried to reassert his voice in decisions about drug routes, union control, Havana's casinos, but the voice grew quieter, the room smaller. He began writing letters, long ones, filled with strategy and questions, like a general in retreat trying to issue orders through the fog of history. He still dressed each day, still used cologne, still read Machiavelli. But beneath the ritual was a man circling something he couldn't name. A fear not of death, but of forgetting. There's a story from 1949, never confirmed but often repeated. Luciano sat alone at a cafe in Naples. A young American soldier stationed nearby recognized him from a newspaper photo and approached cautiously. "Are you really lucky, Luciano?" Luciano looked up, then down at his coffee. "No one's lucky forever," he said, and waved the boy away. He didn't smile. By 1950, American newspapers rarely mentioned him. He was no longer the kingpin, no longer the legend, just an exile with a fading myth. But he remained a symbol of a man who once ruled without ruling, of a system that outgrew its creator, of a deal made during wartime, one forged not in principle, but in desperation. Luciano never returned to the United States, but he never stopped trying to. Matter there, and maybe, in some strange way, he still did, because beneath every union negotiation, every whispered arrangement, every silent nod in a back room, was the ghost of a man who once helped America win a war by promising to keep its harbors quiet. There's an old film reel, unmarked, tucked inside a box once found in a Neapolitan storage room. The celluloid is cracked, but the images flicker. A man sits in a dim hotel suite, watching a black and white movie of New York City. Yellow cabs slide across Lexington Avenue. Newsboys shout headlines. Steam rises from subway grates like breath from a sleeping giant. The skyline is sharp, noble, and impossibly distant. The man watching doesn't speak. He just stares, and every so often he rewinds the same 30 seconds. It is 1947. Charles. Lucky, Luciano is 50. His back aches, his knees stiffen in the cold, but in his mind, he's still the king of New York. The exile had started quietly, a deportation wrapped in handshakes and closed doors. But the aftershock, the real punishment, was not legal, it was emotional. He was forgotten. He lived in Naples, yes, but not as a citizen. He was a man unclaimed, Italian by paperwork, American by legend, but foreign to both. The locals called him L'Americano. The authorities called him a nuisance. The Americans called him a liability. But Luciano was not ready to vanish in late 1946. Just months after stepping onto Italian soil, he made his next move. Havana, Cuba, at the time, was neutral ground, close enough to the U to feel relevant, far enough to avoid headlines. It was Lansky's kingdom, and in Havana, the mob wasn't hiding, it was thriving. Casinos, brothels, race tracks. The Hotel Nacional de Cuba became the unofficial embassy of organized crime. Luciano arrived under a false name, a new passport. He wore dark suits and smoked American cigarettes. The heat made him sweat, but he didn't complain, because in Havana, for the first time in years, he felt something like power. He was back at the table. The mob held a conference. Not official, not written, but understood. Luciano sat it. The head, Lansky beside him, Trafficante, Accardo, Costello, Genovese, they all showed up. Not out of loyalty, but out of recognition. He was still lucky, still the architect. They discussed heroin routes, Havana casinos, union leverage in Florida. The world was moving, and for one golden week, so was Luciano. But he'd forgotten something. He was being watched. The U.S. State Department learned of his presence. The FBI leaned on Cuban officials. Lansky begged for more time, more diplomacy, but the answer came sharp and final: deport him on March 20th. 1947, Cuban soldiers knocked on Luciano's hotel door. No ceremony, no warning. He was placed on a military transport ship and expelled. When he stepped off the boat in Italy, the wind was colder than it should have been. And for the first time, Luciano didn't say a word. He just looked around and knew that Havana had been his last chance. What followed was not life, but slow erosion. Back in Naples, Luciano set up quiet operations, brokering deals between Sicilian heroin producers and American syndicates. But each connection felt thinner. Each favor cost more. The world was changing faster than he could hold it. His correspondence grew erratic. He wrote to Costello, asking for updates no one sent. He wrote to Lansky, offering strategies no one followed. And he kept watching New York movies, not as entertainment, but as sustenance. As if every skyline shot held a memory, he would pause, the reel, and whisper names aloud. Delancey Street, 113th, Maranzano, Dutch, Dewey, each syllable like a rosary bead. Not in prayer, but in remembrance. The letters piled up. Many were returned. Others never acknowledged. He didn't beg. But the silence hurt worse than handcuffs. In 1950, he tried again, a plan to sneak into Mexico. From there to Canada, then across the border. He pitched it to an old associate. The associate nodded, listened, and then told the FBI. Luciano was questioned, warned. It was the last attempt he would ever make to return. By 1951, Luciano's world had shrunk to a few hotels, a few cafes, and a terrace apartment overlooking Via General Orsini. He woke early, ate alone, walked slowly. The once vibrant gestures were now small, fixing his cufflink, folding a handkerchief, turning off the gramophone. He wore suits every day, even when there was no one to see them. He carried a comb, though his hair had begun to thin. He shaved with a silver-handled razor, as if control still mattered. He would sit at the window for hours, not reading, not sleeping, just watching. Sometimes the doorman would see him scribble notes on napkins, ideas, lists, names. Sometimes he mailed them. Often, he just folded them and left them on the table. There were no wives, no children, only visitors, and fewer of those with each passing year. Luciano's paranoia grew. He believed the Carabinieri watched his every move, and often they did. But even when they weren't there, he imagined footsteps in the hallway. He kept a pistol in the drawer, and a photo of his mother on the shelf. The fear wasn't of death. It was of irrelevance. Once, he called Lansky's hotel in Miami. The operator said Mr. Lansky wasn't accepting calls. Luciano didn't argue. He hung up, walked to the window, and lit a cigarette. The flame trembled against the glass. To the city below, he was just another aging man in a chair, but in his mind he still saw Harlem tenements. He still heard Rothstein's voice. He still felt the click of polished shoes on Grand Central marble. He'd lost an empire, but the memory wouldn't leave. In 1953, he granted an interview to a British journalist. The journalist asked if he had regrets. Luciano looked away. "I regret letting other men hold the pen," he said, "because they wrote my ending before I got to the middle." The quote never ran. The article was buried, but that line, raw and unfinished, became the clearest portrait of the man behind the myth. He wasn't trying to reclaim power anymore. He was trying to rewrite the memory of it. Each evening, as Naples turned to shadow, Luciano would turn off the lights and let the reel run. He'd watch men in trench coats, streets he once owned, a skyline too distant to touch, and as the film ticked, frame by frame, he'd mouth the words he used to say out loud. "Everybody pays, even kings." There is something almost cinematic in how it ends. January 26, 1962. A cold afternoon at Naples International Airport. The sky is colorless, drained of light. A breeze presses across the tarmac, tugging at the edge of a wool coat. Lucky Luciano stands by a terminal door, waiting. He's just finished a meeting with Martin Gosch, a Hollywood producer. The topic: a film based on Luciano's life. Gosch wants honesty, the grit, the blood, the empire. Luciano, now 64, wants control. He wants to shape the myth before it escapes him. They shake hands. The conversation is calm, cordial. Then, as Gosch turns away, Luciano stiffens. His right hand rises to his chest. His face tilts skyward, not in fear, but in disbelief. He stumbles once, gasps twice, and collapses onto the polished floor. There is no shootout, no whispered confession, no final order passed through loyal men, just a quiet, sudden silence. Paramedics arrive within minutes. What it's done? Charles Lucky Luciano is dead. The cause is listed as a massive heart attack. He dies not with a pistol in hand, but a movie contract in his briefcase. The irony isn't lost on anyone. A man who sculpted the American underworld, who rewrote the rules of organized crime, dies while trying to turn his life into a screenplay. But the film never gets made. Too controversial, too complicated, too real. His funeral in Naples is small. A few relatives, fewer friends, no grand parade, no eulogies carved in marble. He is buried beneath a slab of stone that lists only the facts. Name, dates, birthplace. But 4,000 miles away, in New York, a different kind of service begins. The streets don't mourn, but they remember. Barbershops replay the news. Old-timers raise glasses. Young hustlers whisper his name like folklore. Because in America, Luciano had become a myth long before he became a corpse. They say he built the 5 families. They say he made peace with war. They say he turned gangsters into businessmen, and business into religion. In truth, he built a machine that outlived him. And now, like all myths, he could no longer contradict it. The last shot isn't a tombstone. It's a reel of film that never rolls. A man who once ruled the docks, the brothels, the unions now, remembered most for the silence after the credits. There are no statues of Lucky Luciano, no plaques, no memorials carved into granite or bronze. But his fingerprints are pressed deep into the cement of American crime, not just in the streets he once ruled, but in the structure that still governs them, because Luciano didn't just build an empire. He built a blueprint in 1931. After the blood-soaked climax of the Castellamarese War, Luciano had stood among the wreckage of the old world and drafted something terrifying in its elegance. A new world, gone were the days of monarchs and mustache Petes. He saw no future in blood feuds or rigid old codes. In their place, he created the Commission, a council of families, a boardroom of killers, a system of checks and balances cloaked in omerta. Each family ran its own territory. Each had a boss, an underboss, a consigliere, but together they answered to the larger machine. Disputes were mediated, territory respected, violence, though not eliminated, became measured, strategic. It was organized crime in its purest form, a silent architecture beneath the surface of cities. Decades passed, the founders died, the bootleggers turned into junkies or corpses. The street corners changed languages, then borders, but the framework remained. Even when the FBI began its long war of attrition, wiretaps, informants, RICO cases, the model held, the names rotated, the faces blurred, but behind each crew, behind each racket, behind each whispered order, stood Luciano's design. It was less a criminal empire than a system of governance. A shadow nation with its own rules, its own diplomacy, its own sense of justice, and like all systems, it became self-sustaining. To prosecutors, Luciano's legacy is a curse, a structure so efficient, so deeply embedded, that it took decades just to chart its lines to the mob. Especially in the mid-20th century, his name is spoken sparingly, if at all. Some avoid it out of superstition, some out of fear, and others out of reverence. He is a ghost in the halls of power, a specter behind every sit-down, every initiation, every family meeting. Not a man, but a memory woven into ritual. In New York, the 5 families he helped codify still bear the scars of his vision. In Chicago, remnants of the National Crime Syndicate, which he once helped unify, flicker through what's left of the outfit. Even in Sicily, the echoes of his return in exile ripple through Cosa Nostra, where whispers of his name once brought both respect and warning. What Luciano left behind wasn't charisma, or fear, or even a body count. He left behind order, the one thing criminal worlds rarely keep, and that order outlived him. To this day, in courtroom testimonies, wiretaps, and declassified files, his blueprint continues to surface. Each arrest peels back a layer, each flipped soldier redraws a diagram, and in each there's the same skeletal structure: boss, underboss, consigliere, capos, soldiers, associates. It's a hierarchy older than most of the men inside it, and it began with one man who hated chaos more than he loved violence. Luciano didn't invent the Mafia, but he refined it. He took the ashes of tradition and shaped them into something modern, scalable, and enduring. And long after his voice went silent, the structure still speaks through rituals, rules, and rituals repeated like scripture in smoky backrooms. That's his real monument. Not in stone, but in silence and shadows and structure. The window is still there. 3rd floor, west side, wrought iron railing, a pale curtain barely stirring. In the breeze, inside, dust rests. Where power once sat, this was Luciano's New York apartment. Not the lavish suite from the peak of his empire, not the prison cell or the exile room in Naples, but the one no one ever photographed, the quiet one, the one he returned to in memory, not in body, where the city didn't know he was watching, or perhaps no longer cared. And that is how all empires fade. Not in fire, but in forgetting. He was born with nothing, a shoeshine boy in a tenement world, the son of Sicilian laborers who crossed the Atlantic with hope and hunger. He gave up prayers for power, rules for survival. He learned early that respect was taken, not given, that America, in its promise, had room for kings, even criminal ones, He built a kingdom of silence and gold. He turned chaos into system. He saw the shape of power, not just its weight. But it came at a cost. For every dollar earned, a man disappeared. For every alliance formed, a betrayal was brokered. He claimed he served America during the war, and maybe he did. But he also served himself, a patriot in the shadows, a traitor to peace. A visionary who saw the future and paved it in blood. Luciano never fired most of the shots. He didn't have to. He understood that power wasn't in the trigger, but in the silence after. That's why some worship him, and others can't say his name. Today, the commission still echoes his blueprint. Rackets still trace the lines he carved. And the myth? It's alive in books, films, whispers in barbershops and courtrooms. But the man faded long ago. Not with a bullet, but with a sigh. A heart giving out beneath the weight of his own memory. At an airport, trying to sell a version of himself that Hollywood didn't want. Now all that's left is silence and dust and echoes. So tonight, if you find yourself drifting between dream and memory, between shadow and city, remember him, not for what he was, but for what he left behind, a child of the street, a maker of systems, a king among killers, and like all kings, destined to sleep among the ghosts he created. In sleep we meet our monsters, and sometimes our kings fade to black. Music low, the world breathes again.